Thank you for watching the video. If this kind of content is something that you would enjoy going forward, please consider throwing out a like, a comment, and a subscribe. That way, you won't miss any of the action. Alright. Good afternoon, gamers. Jaraoh is back. It has been about a month and a half since my most recent video. I had kind of commented, I think, towards that I was, like, kind of having a hard time with planning for my move, and a lot of family stuff going on, and all of the upkeep and turmoil that created, doing things daily, so my new plan was to, instead of doing daily videos, it was going to just be to do videos as things arose that interested me, and I think that is mostly still going to be the plan. Although I do expect more videos to come out over the next couple weeks, just because with the new set released and all of the China regionals starting to take place, there are a lot of interesting things from my point of view that I want to yap about. So yeah, as you can see, new digs. Very happy to be in my new place in Clarksville, Tennessee. A little bit closer to the family, much closer to all my close gamer friends. But yeah, let's go ahead and get into it. So this past weekend was the first Set 2 regional in China, Fuzhou, I believe. And we are going to look at the top 3 placing decks to kind of get a feel for what the meta is looking like at the beginning, and try to add some, high-level analysis, if we can, to why decks are being built the way that they are. You'll definitely notice some trends throughout a lot of the builds, and we're just going to try and, hash out why that's the case, because obviously us in the West, we don't even have access to the cards yet, so we are just, planning our pre-orders and doing a lot of theory crafting for brews, as well as using the information China has given us to our advantage, much like in Set 1, right? So without further ado, as you can see, this is the first place list of Draven, and you're going to see a lot of the standard powerful red cards, right? 3 Hopeful, only 1 Cleave, but I think maybe that's because you have Spinning Axe to take care of a lot of that heavy lifting, right? Very similar effect, a little more expensive, but more permanent, and also can be played on defense, which I think is very valuable. Only 1 Poro as the 6th 2-drop, which I think is very... Oh, no, that's not true. We have Tide Turner. So as the 8th 2-drop, which I think is less interesting now. I think that's quite a bit better. Notably, we will see as we keep looking at decks, Tide Turner was the 3rd most played card in the top 8 of Fuzhou, which I think is really interesting because the West does not value this card as much. And I am not sure going forward if that is because it's more of a particular adaptation to the way Set 2 games play out now, or if it's just a card that they've always rated higher than us. But even their Annie list that made top 8 was playing 3 Tide Turner. So I think that's very interesting. But you still see the Hopefuls, the Kaisas, the Darius. Forerunner is the new... The Magic analogy would be Wormcoil Engine, right? Basically just gigantic body that is very inefficient to trade with in combat, because if it gets to trade with a mid-range threat of your opponents, and then you get the 2-3 might mechs to make up for that, you end up very far ahead on board. And as we all know, this game is very board-centric. It is very important to be fighting for the board. So, only 1 of those to help mitigate that. You've got the 1 Mind Splitter, which I think this card is going to start just seeing more universal play. This card is incredibly powerful. The ability by the turn 3 to 4 range to look at your opponent's hand, strip any card, and then not even have to downsize or sacrifice your board presence to do so, ends up just being insanely powerful. And I think it's a slight hedge against just other purple decks in general, because the purple decks have a lot of these tricks, right? They have a lot of these Ride the Winds, Fight or Flights, Rebukes, what have you, Spinning Axe in the Draven Mirror Match case. And it's very important to know which of these cards you need to play around. And oftentimes, you can get a ton of value, more than just the card that you strip, by also knowing which effects you need to play around and which ones you don't. For example, obviously, you can make a pretty, gimmicky attack of, a 6 might into a 5 might unit if you know, for example, that they don't have a spinning axe up, right? So I think that's pretty interesting. And then Bryn here, which is similar to Mind Splitter in the sense that it's like it helps with the tricks and specifically the mirror match. I think this is like a card that is very good against the Draven mirror match, and I think it's very good against Irelia, which, spoiler, we will see later. But just the ability to turn off your opponent from playing cards for a turn when you're trying to set up a keyboard for a key attack just ends up being incredibly valuable. Other notable new purple cards, we actually have quite a few here. So, Treasure Hunter, new 2-drop of choice. It's Student? No, Student was Ravenbloom. It's Watchful Sentry-esque in the fact that a lot of its value is just coming from, in that case, it's Death Knell. In this case, it's Move. The treasure, so that you don't, keep falling behind on resources as you want to continue to play your powerful cards or hide cards that you have access to, etc. But the 1 might can be a drawback in a lot of spots, so that's why you don't see it maxed out. The Overzealous Fan, I'm not sure how good this 2-drop is for, like, the generic purple deck. But in Draven, it's absolutely bonkers, right? Because of the way your legend ability works. If you have Fan and Hunter, or Fan and another unit on a board, they attack. You can pop the Fan, bounce their guy back. That counts as you win a combat, you draw a card. That's obviously completely outrageous for the game mechanics to work, but that's how it works. Because of that interaction, Rebuke has gotten quite a bit better. But I think Rebuke would be on the uptick regardless because of the existence of gold tokens, right? The gold tokens being able to make you a power cost ends up making Rebuke just being a completely overtuned effect when you can mitigate the power cost. Basically, the only card that answers it now, because it has always gotten around Defy, is going to be Not So Fast, which is a commonly played card, but as you'll notice, the decks that want Not So Fast, they're very, like, Ultron-y decks, right? Voltron-y decks. They're kind of all in, usually on, like, one big unit, which is fine, but that means that you only have 3 Not So Fast for protection, usually, right? So you're very reliant on making sure that you line up your Not So Fast with the Rebukes and the Switcheroos, which is the next card we're going to talk about, of the world, and really rely on your Defies to carry the weight on the cards that Defy is allowed to counter. And that puts a lot of pressure on the Not So Fast deck when you need all of your cards to line up exactly well. And then Switcheroo. This card ends up being so much better than I gave it credit for. I did not really give this card a lot of credit when I first started seeing it in lists. I kind of thought it was just overcosted and not really the right way to play the game. But after watching a lot of the VODs that I have, I was just absolutely wrong. This card ends up just being completely bonkers. You end up in this scenario a lot where you are playing 8 2-drops, so you will get stat checked a bunch. It lines up obviously incredibly well with Draven, but the part that I missed is that it just ends up being a very, very good card to hide onto a board that has 2 small units on it. Or even a small unit and a medium-sized unit, right? Because once you play around Fight or Flight, right? Because that's obviously the nightmare scenario, is you've only got 1 unit to defend the battlefield, and then you hide this, and then they just Fight or Flight your guy back, and you lose the Switcheroo for free. As long as you mitigate that, like, corner case where it performs poorly, this card just is always going to trade profitably, and you can kind of almost look at it like a massive, like, tempo shift, because you're just going to trade for a bigger unit usually. But there are plenty of scenarios where it ends up being even quite a bit better than that, because you draw the card off Draven if you win the combat, and your opponent oftentimes, like, if you set up a large enough board, they will have to overextend resources into you in order to be able to win the fight preemptively anyways. So then you end up in this scenario where you're not just switching a 1 or a 2 with a 4 or a 5, you end up in this scenario where you're switching a 1 or a 2 with a 7 or a 9, in some cases with Darius, 10 or 12, and it ends up being just an incredibly powerful card for the small cost of what oftentimes is just going to be one power, right? Another notable thing before we get into the sideboard that I think is really interesting is the battlefield choice. So I think the person that won this event did an excellent job of kind of maximizing where they want their what they want their plans to be for each of the individual games. So Reaver's Row was their game one battlefield, where they were happy to have that on the play or the draw. And obviously it creates some like problematic spots in the mirror match where you're both just trading Draven legend procs, because that does work similarly to the overzealous fan, right? If you're sitting on Reaver's Row and they attack, you proc Reaver's Row, they count as winning the combat, and alternatively, if you attack into Reaver's Row and they pull their guy back, that counts as you winning the combat because the combat started with a unit for each player. That's the current way that the rules work, and as long as that is the case, that interaction is going to be really powerful. So it makes the mirror match a little gimmicky, but in every other matchup, I think it just provides this spot where you're happy to trade back and forth on points because you're just going to draw a card every time you do that, and your opponent is going to be more likely to have to take a stand somewhere, and it's just very hard to lose in that spot when your opponent decides that they want to take a stand with all the combat tricks that the deck has access to. And then on the play game is Targons, so you kind of get that Annie-esque effect of readying your runes to sit on a bunch of your tricks, which in this case is very plentiful, right? We've got Ride the Winds that we can play, we've got Fight or Flights, we've got Rebukes, we've got Switcheroos, we've got Spinning Axes. That was 10 cards that I pointed to right there. That's not even counting Stack Deck into some of this, or Cleave, even though, you would be the defender in this scenario, you can still proc things like Darius. Edge of Night, another hidden card that technically counts as being played on your opponent's turn. Some more Darius tricks to work with there, notably. But yeah, this ends up being kind of your resource cheating effect, which I think is just quite a bit better than leaning into something that you already do well. You would see some people maybe play like the Grove, but the deck draws enough cards. I think you want to try and abuse an access that you don't already take full advantage of. I really like seeing the Targon's Peak here as you're on the play game, because generally speaking, you can defend it so well, right? One of the things Draven does is, especially when you get to pass a turn with open mana, you're so oppressive, because your opponent, if they ever make an attack into you, and they're wrong about being able to win the fight, they almost instantly lose the game, right? Because you didn't just time walk them, you also time walked them and drew an additional card. So it creates these like really, really problematic play patterns. And then the next very interesting thing that I think is worth discussing is I think a lot of people have been in the know that Obelisk on the draw creates some like very cool play patterns where it's like it lets you skimp on your 2-drops a little bit. Like, I would not be surprised at all if the winner of this event's plan was in games where he was on the draw or expected to go second. He actually cut a bunch of 2-drops from his deck and probably went down to 5 or 6 2-drops, with the logic being that he was pretty much always just planning to play a turn 1 Draven regardless. And this is something that, like I said, a lot of people have been in the know existed, but couldn't actually pull the trigger on because it was such a liability against Aurora. But we live in this world right now where Aurora is so gimmicky and unreliable against all of the gear hate that exists now, because gear just became so much more prevalent with the format, that unless you're exactly playing Aurora and then exactly hitting Mind Splitter and then taking their exactly one piece of gear removal, the deck kind of falls apart. And you just end up in this spot where it's like so many of your cards don't do anything because your whole game plan revolves around Aurora. And if they have an answer to the Aurora, you kind of don't do anything. And it's so much harder to play a fair game now with just like the Death Bloom Predators and the Mind Splitters and things like that. So Aurora has been on a massive decline, and that allows these mid-range or even aggressively slanted decks, depending on how you want to look at them, to take advantage of this Obelisk of Power on the draw interaction. So even though it's still always going to be better to go first, right? That I saw that was, some discourse that happened in a lot of these earlier conversations. I'll go ahead and plant my flag on that aspect of it. You always want to choose to go first. You always want to choose to go first. The math actually never supports wanting to go second, because even if there's like a weird breakpoint where you get to play something a turn earlier, you just get to play it after your opponent has taken the same turn regardless. Like, it doesn't actually, like, in a world where you could have played, like, Aurora on turn 2 because you were on the draw in, like, a double obelisk game in set 1, that's the same as playing an Aurora on turn 3 on the play. It's like the same thing, but you just got an extra turn of development. So, I think people kind of misunderstood that more broad theory aspect early in the game's lifespan that hopefully people will not miss before. But having said that, you are still going to be on the draw in some games, by force, because you're obviously going to win some game 1s or game 2s, if the case may be. And having a plan where you can maximize the game where you are on the draw is obviously very good, right? A game where say your mirror match opponent only gets to play like a Pouty Poro, and then you get to play a Draven. Well, you've done the first part of the game to set up, you've made it through stage 1 of the game to play the more dominant board thing, because now your opponent has to decide, because of the nature of the way the Draven mirror match works, where you can't just trade points. They may not even be able to go in with their 2-drop, right? If it's like a Pouty Poro, for example, if they don't have a way to keep your Draven out, they can't actually go in, because then you're just going to take their point, take their Poro, and take a card. So they have to be incredibly confident that they can win that exchange. And I think that's pretty hard to do, very often, especially in a scenario where, imagine, it's an obelisk game, so they play a 2-drop and then they are up to 5 runes. I mean, what exactly are they going to do? Are they going to stack a 4-drop on, and then they're just like, they lose to Cleave? Or Spinning Axe? That doesn't sound good. Are they going to play another 2-drop and sit on 3 runes, and then pray that the 1 Fight or Flight is enough, and that you don't have a Kaisa or a Darius plus stack deck? I don't know, right? I mean, that's going to be where a lot of the interesting lines of these gameplay, for the mirror specifically, kind of comes to fruition. But yeah, I am a massive enjoyer now that you can kind of get away with it with the exit of Aurora in the metagame. This Obelisk on the draw tech. I'm a big, big fan of that. And I think more mid-range decks should look into doing that, maybe. But then that can create a new weird dynamic where then does the person on the play get to play their Obelisk on the play because they know that the opponent is going to do that on the draw? And then now it's 4 versus 5 and not 3 versus 4 on turn 1 resources. And then you end up in this exact scenario again where being on the play is just a massive advantage, because obviously then turn 1 Draven on the play, or turn 1 Kaisa on the play, or whatever, just ends up being incredibly powerful. So I'm not sure. I think that sounds like a little bit more of a gambit, because you're already going to be at an advantage when you're on the play in those games anyways. So I don't think there's a lot of reason to have to do that much min-maxing, especially in particular with Obelisk. But I do think those are the kind of things that need to be thought about. And then we'll hint on the sideboard a little bit, mostly because it's just increased numbers. You have Longsword, which is kind of just a worse version of Draven Spinning Axe. You've got the 3rd Ride the Wind and the 3rd Bryn here. These are just kind of like, I think, fine-tuning your numbers to make sense that in the purple mirror match, you've got access to Bryn here when you want it. And I think they're probably just going very big. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if, like, Forerunner is a card that you don't want in the mirror, right? Because it's just, like, lines up so poorly against Rebuke and Fight or Flight. Whereas the Mind Splitter and the Bryn here line up much better. But you have so much, let's call it card velocity. That's what we call it in Magic, where this deck is just going to see so many cards due to the Legend ability and stack deck that you can get away with these very small numbers of very high impact cards. And I think that's why you're seeing 1 Cleave, 1 Forerunner, 1 Mind Splitter, because you're just going to see these cards more often than you would think you would for a 1-of in your 40-card deck. And then really the last interesting thing that I think to talk about for Draven is this against the odds card, it's like a reaction speed pump spell that can be pretty massive against like the swarmy style decks. The main reason I think this is interesting is because this deck chose to not play Thermo Beam, right? I think most red decks or decks that don't have other gear removal would be playing Thermo Beam. This deck is not playing Thermo Beam, and I guess the logic there is like, you know, you're playing Edge Knight, whereas I think a lot of the variants may not be. But I think it's really interesting in this day and age to play 0 gear removal, because just like what we were saying about on the with Aurora being on the decrease, I actually, kind of looking at this list, think that Aurora might be pretty well positioned against it, right? Like, Forerunner, they can outclass pretty heavily. A lot of everything else that you're doing is kind of what they're used to playing against, right? I mean, if you've only got the 2 Rebukes and the 2 Fighter Flights as, like, very problematic cards for their big units, I could see this being a really hard matchup if Aurora did want to make a kind of comeback. That would not surprise me at all. But it struggles so much elsewhere, I think that that's like still probably pretty unlikely and something that you can abuse in the metagame. So, yeah, this is the number 1 boogeyman. This is what you need to be prepared for. And this is probably going to be my starting point for Bologna. And I assume several other people's as well, right? It's proven from all of the prep that we've done, city challenges in the East, now the regional in Fuzu, and then, you know, the Western tournament scene via online. Draven is dominating. Draven is absolutely dominating, and it even, I think it was, I don't have my numbers pulled up, so I could have this misaligned a little bit, but I believe it was 35% of the field in day 1, and then its conversion rate jumped up to, it was 64% of the day 2 field, the top cut field. So not only was it the most played deck, it also was the best performing deck. That's generally a problem coming from other games. Usually the most played deck is a 49 to like 53% style deck, and because so many people are playing it, right, sheer volume, they usually are underrepresented in day 2, aside from the people that go on to, you know, win the events. And that was not the case in this event. It massively overperformed here. So that's not something you can take for granted, right? You definitely have to keep an eye on that. But that's where we're at right now. This is Public Enemy number 1, so be prepared. Next, we're going to look at, let's actually look at the second place list, just for simplicity's sake. So the next 2 decks we're going to look at are Fiora and Irelia. And even though they both lost to, well, I guess technically only the Fiora deck lost to a Draven, you should assume going in that at least these players, even if Draven is still favored or the number 1 problem deck, both of these players found success against Draven with these lists most of the event, which is very important because they at least had a plan, right? They at least had a plan. Notably here, this is the first time I'm really seeing a Fiora that's starting with Victorious, which is very interesting to me, especially when they're playing a 1-3 split. This is, I think, one of the big things that Fiora gets, as opposed to, like, this color combination from set, is actually this Fiora. I think this Fiora is very, very good, and the fact that it gives you pseudo haste on all of your, or accelerate, I should say, on all of your big units, or kind of all of your units just in general, if you end up having a BF sword draw, which is why it's such an important card in the deck, that I'm really surprised that it's starting Fiora and then only playing 1 random Fiora. Like, if you've decided that you want to start 4-cost Fiora, that's fine, but then I don't know why there's only 1 of this Fiora, because I feel like this Fiora is so powerful. But be that as it may. So this deck is doing a few things. It is abusing what this color combination is pretty much always abused, even from set 1. No pun intended. Your units are gigantic. your units are completely massive, but you struggle with card draw a little bit. So you are seeing that mitigated here, with all 3 of the battlefield choices being ways for you to draw cards. In general, decks like this, they get more per card value than a lot of their opponents' cards. They're a little overrate, if that makes sense. So even in the world where you're exchanging drawing cards with your opponents for these battlefields, that's usually gonna benefit you on a 1-to-1 rate. Not always, but most of the time, that's kind of how that assessment works. Other notable things is this deck is also very much skimping on 2 mana units. Only 3 Pit Rookie, which you don't even really want to play on turn 2 regardless, and then the 3 Unsung Hero. Really leans this deck into... I think you should take the implication from this that you're okay missing your turn 2 play more often than, say, another deck normally would be. I don't know how I feel about that, but I think that is the implication that you have to take, right? You've got challenges for removal, you have a lot of speed with the first mate, and then the Fiora worthy in particular. This deck gets to play Salvage main. As you can see, this concoction is 1 main, 2 sideboard, which is kind of a nod to the way that the metagame has shifted, where these gear are very, very important. 1 sabotage with the other 1 in the board. I kind of am a sabotage enjoyer. I think I would want to start with more than 1 of those in, but I understand that, like, again, the deck has card draw issues, so it's really hard to kind of just trade at that 1-for-1 rate when your card is going to be always equal power level, or in Sabotage's case, under power level, because you're paying the cost of the card, and then the card you're taking your opponent traded with for free, effectively, right? Because they did not have to spend the cost to play the card. Riposte ends up being completely bonkers. Probably just one of the best signature spells in the game. Getting a counterspell in this color combination that doesn't normally have it is incredibly powerful. But also, the format has not slowed down on being combat-centric. So a lot of times the way the game will play out against like something like Irelia, for example, is you're ahead by a lot on a board, and then they go to push the board, and the second that they play whatever the largest might gap would be, so you think like Defiant Dance or like a Fight or Flight on one of your large units, or even a Rebuke in some cases, you end up in this scenario where you've traded your riposte. It's normally counterspells are just you're trading 1 card for 1 card. In this scenario, when you're like in the middle of a combat, it ends up being kind of a 2-for-1, right? Because you're countering the card that they played, but then you're also getting an effect added on, presumably in a combat that they're already trying to win and are behind in. So it very often is 2 cards for the price of 1. And then you end up in the reverse scenario, right, where if your opponent goes for a big play, I mean, imagine your opponent plays a Cathian Rain against you, you play this card, you buff a unit, they're not getting that battlefield that turn, right? It's a guaranteed hold point, guaranteed value. It's pretty much Kaisa, not completely gone from the meta, but a Cathian Rain is a card that is very, very wary these days. Most people are not playing it main, as they shouldn't be, because this card exists, and they are even using it very, very sparingly in the sideboard, because a lot of times the games don't play out that way, because now with the existence of equipment, a Cathian Raining and killing 2 units and leaving a gear around ends up being significantly worse than it was previously, right? Because instead of killing 2 big units and a small unit, now you're killing a medium unit and a small unit, or 2 medium units, because that's all you could kill because one of them had an equipment on it, right? Punch First, great example here. One, Warmog, very interesting to me. It's got synergy with Call to Glory, which is otherwise, aside from that and Set, pretty hard to proc. But I think you're like not that unhappy to play Call to Glory for the 3 mana, especially since it lines up in a way where I think having the flexibility of Punch First at 1 energy, 2 power, and then Call at 3 energy makes it to where you should be able to represent one of them pretty often, and I think that's a really good place to be. Notably, they both also buff your Unsung Hero to a stage where you draw 2 cards off of it. Notably, that's one of the reasons that the BF Sword is so strong. And then the deck playing 3 Doran's Blade, it seems like it's... I guess you're doing the Lucian first mate thing, and then Pit Rookie kind of works with it as well. Okay, so I see the vision. So you're often trying to make Doran's Blade enough to make your units mighty as well. Alright, I get that, and I like this deck a lot. I generally like drawing a few more cards than what this deck is capable of, but this deck is doing something very, very powerful. And it is basically fighting Draven on a one-to-one basis of its cards just being stronger, right? I mean, you're trying to get a Fiora onto a battlefield with a sword on it, you know, pull your Lucian back after getting a point, get a big set on a battlefield, get a big Fiora on a battlefield, get a big Unsung Hero on a battlefield, and you're just trying to sit on your tricks and your removal, right? Your challenges, your hidden blades, your riposte, etc. And this has always kind of been a problem for the red-purple combination in general, right? So, as most of you know, I was a big Annie player in set 1. That was my deck of choice. And I'm pretty sure set was my worst matchup. Just the way that their cards line up and are so big, so early in the game, and it's like you only have so many fight or flights and rebukes. And even in this world where, unlike against like the Aurora decks where the fight or flights or rebukes were so game-breaking because their cards were so expensive, that ends up just not being the case in a lot of these orange-yellow decks, because the things that you care about bouncing so much are just 3 and 4 and 5 mana units, so they're just replaying them. So that ends up being like a really big deal, specifically in the Draven matchup, which, as we said a lot with set 1 against Kai'Sa, you really do need to have your plan and your prep for how you're going to approach the Draven matchup. Because if you go to an event, if you're preparing for, say, Bologna, as an example, like I am, it is going to be 30 to 40% of the metagame. You should expect to play against it 3 or 4 times at a minimum in your 9 rounds of Swiss. So, playing something that, even if it's just a broad theory, lines up really well against that deck is a very good place to be, I think. And I think this deck does do that, for example. I think it has problems. I think this color combination will continue to have flaws. But I really like a lot of what this deck is doing. Only immediate changes that I would want to look at is I would want an extra 2-dropper or 2, and I would like to lean into something that's maybe a little more, like, maybe I would want to lean into, like, more Warmog's armors. I don't really know how you get them in, but more Warmogs, oh, that's a bit of a tongue twister, and Sabotages are cards that I really like, and then I think I would switch the Worthy and the Victorious Fiora. It's not immediately obvious to me. I understand what this switch does, unless they're just so confident that because of, like, the existence of Falling Star or something, that this Fiora is just better against Draven, and that's enough of a reason to do it. But I really like the idea of just getting to cheat your turn 1 play count by playing Fiora Worthy in the champ zone, and then every game that you're on the draw, you have a guaranteed turn 1 play. I really like that aspect of the 3-drop Fiora. So that's where I think I would be. We've already talked about the battlefields a little bit. Last thing really to talk about is sideboard choices, maxing out on salvages. Makes sense. A lot of gears going around, a lot of equipments. Cannon Barrage, very good against the Swarm decks, right? Very good against like any kind of Victor or Azir-based strategy, which I think both of those have potential to be quite good. The extra Sabotage, predominantly going to be against purple, right? Just same as what we were saying about Mind Splitter from the Draven deck. In that matchup in particular, because they're so reliant on having a bunch of tricks represented and having you play into them incorrectly, just getting to look at your opponent's hand and know what's up, know which tricks you have to play around, ends up being incredibly valuable. So that warrants the second Sabotage there, and then, like I said, in my opinion, maybe even a third. Unyielding Spirit, kind of a concession to red removal still existing, although I do think it's on the downswing. Might actually even be more for blue removal these days. I think the blue removal, like Singularity, is actually more popular than, you know, the Void Seekers and the Acathian Reigns of the world. Falling Star, I guess, is a great example of a tool that you want. And then the last little tech piece here is Facebreaker, and I think Facebreaker is very good. I think stuns, the way that they line up, in particular on defense, against Draven is very good. This card is coming in against Draven because they are trying to do like the spinning axe cleave, like get over you in one attack thing and win the combat. And having a no power cost way to just shut down the combat, because they don't have counterspells aside from sometimes Hard Bargain, right? And they don't even all play that. And it's not like Hard Bargain hard counters this anyways. But just a flat-out I win the combat button, where, especially on defense, where their unit just goes back to base, ends up being incredibly valuable. I think cards like this should be on the rise more. I think one stun effect, even though it's a very nice catch-all, and it's a very nice, like, kind of like high ceiling variant, which you will hear me talk about in a lot of my videos. I actually think these stun cards are good enough now in the format to just warrant playing more than one of them, quite honestly. But yeah, I like this deck, and this is one of the decks that I'm very much going to look at for Bologna prep. And then last but not least is the one that I think I enjoy the most, though admittedly, I think I have the most unorthodox view of how I think it should be built, so I have quite a few opinions on that matter, but for the most part, I think it will do us a lot of justice to see how this guy made it as far into the event as he did. So this is your Irelia deck. This is gonna be kind of your like very Voltron-y, you're just trying to win realistically with the one Irelia and the Dravens, and Vex to some degree. But as you can see, basically no 2-drops, right? This list was... You will see some lists that will play some number of Lonely Poro or Treasure Hunters. None of them from this deck. This deck was completely ignoring that. They were only trying to play Stellacorn Herders on turn 2, Irelia on turn 2 if they were on the draw in a matchup where it was safe to do so. Which I assume is not very often, right? Because it's like, Fiora has Challenge, Draven has Falling Star. But maybe you don't play around Falling Star from Draven that much because it's not a 3 of. I'm not sure. I'll have to get more testing in to have an answer for that. But be that as it may, this deck is very, very low on units, and it is very much trying to win the game with just Irelia and just Draven. And it is abusing cards like Guardian Angel and Ride the Wind to do that in a way where you can win multiple combats in a turn. One thing I will say that I like about this list in particular, so you'll see the Guardian Angels and the Zonias, these effects end up being really powerful, as we know from set 1, especially when you're not set up in a way where they just get used up by, like, very, like, cheap, redundant units. The fact that these are always bringing back an Irelia, or a Herder, or a Vex, or a Draven, gives these cards a ton of value, for sure. And I might even be interested in... Oh, I was gonna say maximize. I didn't realize it was 3 and 3 right off the rip. Yeah, I love that they're just playing the full 6 of this effect. I think that's really powerful. This is also, as you can see, I had mentioned earlier, this is kind of the first not-so-fast deck we've seen. When you're totally reliant on being able to protect one of your effectively 3 units that you're planning on winning the game with, because you're mostly planning on winning the game with Irelia and Draven. You need to be able to stop your opponent from just killing it outright with the auto-kill cards, right? So I'm thinking like Rebuke, Fight or Flight into key combat, but from yellow I'm talking Hidden Blades, or even something like Vengeance if that starts to be on the rise. Having these effects that directly protect your creature, to give it like pseudo hexproof to make another magic comparison, ends up being very valuable. And you can even see it's like this deck is still playing 3 Defy because there are other things that you want to counter, and you still care about the mana efficiency, right? This deck is still going to want to counter sabotages. It's still going to want to counter challenges that end up being a problem. It's going to want to counter Ride the Winds, which is something that Not So Fast is not allowed to counter, right? So I think this deck is very powerful. As you can see, I mean, it's playing the full suite of the 9 pump spells, 5 counter spells, 6 protection spells, 7 counter spells, well, 6 counter spells if you count Hard Bargain as well. And I think this is kind of stage 1 of how to build an Irelia Vultron deck, right? If you looked at the set and you said, I just want to play an Irelia-only pump spell deck, this is how you would do it. This is how you would do it. I am a bit of a low drop enjoyer. I think I would prefer the versions that lean a little more into the 2-drop units personally. But I definitely see the vision here. Maxing out on your fighter flights. I love the one of gear versatility. I love that they don't just decide which one they like more and play 2 copies of them, because a lot of them have large opportunity cost if you draw the second one. So just Boots of Swiftness for your Draven and Irelia ends up being incredibly powerful. And then you have Heart of Dark Ice for the increased power on your turn at your sorcery speed, your normal speed. And I think this gives the deck a lot of power, in particular with Irelia, where you get to turn this into effectively a 3 energy 1 power. Now all of your units that you play, which admittedly there are not very many of them, but they will all have Accelerate, right? Because you just then get to ready them with the Irelia ability, and I think that ends up being very, very powerful. Very powerful. So yeah, this deck is, I think, really sweet. I think the battlefields should be discussed. It's doing something very similar to what Fiora is doing, Dreaming Tree and Sunken Temple. As you can see, obviously, this deck is far and away the best Dreaming Tree deck that could exist, right? Because you've got the 9, 10, 11, effectively 14, right? I don't think I'm missing one. You effectively have 14 spells that target, or that have the ability to target your units, which is completely absurd, obviously. And then you even have Vex to make them cost less in particular spots of combat. Incredible. And then you have Sunken Temple, which in a low-to-the-ground version, I think you can't get away with as much, because there's opportunity costs where your opponent will be able to take better advantage of it. This deck, what are we conquering with that's not going to be 5 power, right? Vex and Draven already meet that threshold. Irelia already meets that threshold because it's when you ready her, right? You choose a ready me. So if you just play her and ready her on that turn, that's 5 right there. And then Herder is the only one, but you get your value out of Herder just from moving it. And then now you end up in this spot where you just can play your, if you're going to Sunken Temple, you can just play your pump spell before combat. That's totally fine too. Like, imagine you are in a world where you just want to cycle on guard. You're allowed to do that with the Herder. And then you're going to get to draw the card from the move anyway, so you're getting card advantage that way. Or you can just sit on it and not use the Sunken Temple, also totally fine. But then you end up in a Boots of Swiftness world, where then you can just go back. Boots of Swiftness is a card that has been very impressive to me. A deck that I will probably do a video on at some point from the coverage was the Pit Crew Ezreal deck. That was kind of utilizing Pit Crew, Boots of Swiftness, and Cole to kind of just, like, run laps around the battlefield. I think that was really cool. And Boots of Swiftness just ends up being an incredibly powerful card. I think ganking in general is proving to just be an incredibly powerful keyword that isn't getting utilized enough, quite honestly. But yeah, I think this deck is sweet. I think this deck has flaws, notably. I mean, like I said, I think these Voltron-style decks, if you don't play perfectly around, your Draven opponent's Rebuke or your yellow opponent's Hidden Blades maybe less so specifically, right, because you have so much protection. But I think this kind of stuff is very interesting, and this is also a color combination that I very much enjoy. Like I said, I played a bunch of Annie, but I really did try to make Yasuo work for a long time. And I think this deck is honestly just really sweet. Should talk about the Conservatory. When you defend here, reveal the top card of your main deck. If it's a spell, put it into your hand. Very, very good card specifically for Irelia because we're so spell dense. This is a battlefield that you would see something like Unitless Victor play. I mean, we can do a quick count, right? We're looking at, what is this, 12, 14, 16, 17, 8, 25. So this is a 25 spell deck. Yeah, I mean, that's it right there, right? 25 spells. That means you're sitting on, I mean, what is that? I'm not a numbers guy. Over 50%, though. Yeah, trying to do math in a video is not going to be my forte. I mean, over 50% to hit off Conservatory, and you are presumably going to be defending a lot because your opponent is going to try and go into your Irelias and your Dravens, right? And even the herders, even if they don't think they're going to win the combat, they have to deal with the herder, right? Because they don't want you just moving it back to base and drawing a card. So a lot of your units are creating these like very weird lines where your opponent is going to want to attack into you. It's totally possible if you start behind on the board that your Draven opponent might just say, all right, I'm never attacking until I know I can win the fight, and then just continue to play a board. But even then, you're going to get point tempo, right? You're going to be ahead on points because they're presumably not fighting you. So I think this deck attacks from a very, very cool axis. I think it's very likely better than like the Ornn variant, which is doing something very similar, right? It's trying to get a massive Ornn and then just win with Ornn by itself. I also kind of think as good as Shirelia's is, I think like Boots of Swiftness just ends up being like a more efficient, better version of the same card, which is kind of sad for Ornn. But yeah, I think this deck is fantastic. I think it looks like a lot of fun to play. And as I said with Fiora and with Draven, these were the top 3 decks for a reason. They are going to be my starting point for the gauntlet for my Bologna prep. And I think that they should be the same for everybody else's as well. Alright guys, that's going to do it for me. Thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. And if you enjoy this kind of stuff, hit the like button, throw out a comment, subscribe. And I will see you all next time. Peace.